And I don't think it's good cop. The Obama administration tried to make it a good cop situation, a bad cop situation, and it was a very unwise thing to do. And the fallout has been very severe in Moscow and in Germany. But apparently, Obama suggested that to Medvedev first, that they recreate this so-called bilateral commission that had existed during the Clinton administration, which featured Russian Prime Minister Chernomyrdin and Vice President Gore. If there was ever anything to provoke and outrage the Russian political class, that was it. First of all, it took an example from what they regard as the disgraceful, humiliating 1990s and offered it as a model for today. Secondly, Chernomyrdin, may his family live happily ever after, was the epitome of corruption in Russia. What he did was preside over the oligarchical plundering of Russia. So to suggest that now maybe Putin could play the role of Chernomyrdin was a terrible insult. But above all, it was to suggest that Biden and Putin are equals. Biden is a political corpse. He's living out an honorable, funereal career. Putin will probably be the leader of, if he's not today, probably may well be again, of Russia. They were blown away. And evidently, Chancellor Merkel of Germany just lost her about what had happened there because she's working her own deal with the Russians. And she didn't like it at all. So the answer is it was not a successful venture. As for Azerbaijan, oil, and Iraq, Iraq's an occupied country. It may continue to be an occupied, but when the Americans leave, they're going to need the Russians because the Russians built the energy infrastructure of Iraq. So the Russians want their contracts back, and the Obama administration is talking with them about that. I don't know whether you want to heat your house on Iraqi oil or whatever in the future, and as for Azerbaijan, it's completely at Russia's mercy. They're playing a game with Washington, but when the Russians crossed the border into Georgia last August, the leader of Azerbaijan flew immediately to Moscow. So I don't think we want to have an energy policy based on those two countries. I don't. No, certainly Europe doesn't.
Two quick questions here. Do either of you think that there's any prospect of history somewhere along the line rehabilitating George Bush the Younger? And my second question is, did either of you take note of Hillary Clinton in India yesterday describing this as the world's oldest democracy? And were you embarrassed by the parochialism of that remark?
On the first question, I would defer to Eric Foner of our editorial board. I don't see any, I mean, never say never, but it is very difficult to see history rehabilitating George W. Bush. On Hillary Clinton, what struck me about that trip, and maybe Steve has a comment, is we're very concerned about nuclear proliferation, very concerned about Pakistan, very concerned about Iran. And yet the United States under George W. Bush, maybe primarily for economic reasons we still don't know, deals cut, sold, my understanding is sold the fuel that India could use in civilian enrichment programs, which then allows it to move more quickly to a nuclear program. So we have laid the groundwork for proliferation in one of the most dangerous regions of the world. I didn't hear her statement about America being the oldest democracy.
No, India is the largest. She said India largest, America oldest.
Well, she's had a tough month with her injury. I mean, if she's had a tough month with India and then a tough period with Russia, as you may recall, when she showed up with the button that was the reset button, but they had mistranslated the term to mean overload instead of reset, and that was not a good. But let me just take 1 second. When we were in Moscow, we met with the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, the man Hillary Clinton gave the overload button to. And, you know, they had their full of George W. Bush for all the reasons Steve described, withdrawal from ABM, just a whole series, NATO expansion. But he did say about the Obama administration that there is a feeling that they are listening. And I might gently disagree with Steve coming out of the summit that we don't know yet what was fully discussed there. We're not privy to it. I mean, words are words, meaning Obama is saying one thing in those speeches, but they're deeds. I mean, for all we know, Obama is saying to the Russian leadership, we will put the missile defense on the back burner, we will put NATO on the back burner. You're helping us with Afghanistan, deals are cut. These are not the prettiest things. But I was surprised, my father, who was here, told me that there is an article in which Gorbachev is quite sanguine about some of the possibilities for a U.S.-Russian relationship. He may have his own reasons, but I think his voice is worth listening to in the context of his own experience as Steve described it.
Has Gorbachev written about the last few years of contemporary Russian history?
No.
I was just asking if Gorbachev has written about the last few years of recent history.
Yeah.
Along the lines of the lost alternatives.
It's hard on him. Chapter 6 of my book is called Gorbachev's Lost Legacies. Briefly, I argue that it was Gorbachev who began the democratization of Russia when it was Soviet Russia. And that the de-democratization of Russia, which we now attribute to Putin, actually began under Yeltsin. Once the political class or the oligarchical class had seized all that property, democracy wasn't possible because a free parliament would have taken the property back and possibly hung them. And that's why, the main reason there's no, in addition to Russia's tradition maybe, there's no democracy in Russia today. It won't be until they solve the problem. The other legacy that I attribute to Gorbachev is having given the world a chance to end the Cold War. It's hard for him, and Katrina and I have known him well for almost 20 years. He's been very kind to us and our family. My daughter, who's standing in the back of the room, had just arrived, has heard enough of her mother and father talk, so comes at the end of events, rightly so. Is sure Gorbachev is her godfather because he invariably gives her dating advice. None of it good. Russians are very different about that. So I feel close to him, but the reality is it's difficult to be a very, very great man and live on. Because you live on observing what becomes of the greatness you achieved, or you think you achieved, but with no power to affect it. I did something very bad. A few years ago, we were invited, Katrina and I, to a small conference in honor, I guess it was Gorbachev's 70th birthday, and the subject was how Gorbachev ended the Cold War. And I gave a little talk called The Cold War Never Ended. And then I thought to myself, that was really stupid what you did. Couldn't you have talked about something else? And he took it well, argued with me, but agreed that that legacy was in danger at least. So I don't think that what he writes and says about it today, I think what he writes and says is conditioned as much by his desperate effort to leave his legacy intact and not in smithereens when his time to go comes. Because democracy in Russia certainly is not in good shape. And if I'm right that the Cold War was not ended or a new one began, then that legacy is not in good shape either. So what he says is, I find it sentimentally interesting, but not insightful now.